The auditorium was full the night Tessa Nwosu walked in through the service entrance. Not because she was late, not because she was lost, because the security guard at the main door had looked at her registration badge, looked at her face, and said, without lowering his voice, "Contractors use the side door." She wasn't a contractor. She was the keynote presenter. Tessa adjusted the strap of her laptop bag, took the long way around the building through the November cold, and did what her grandmother in Winnipeg had always told her to do when she felt the particular kind of anger that had no clean outlet. She counted her steps. 1, 2, 3. Not because counting helped, because it gave her feet something to follow while her mind stayed quiet and sharp and ready. She had 47 minutes until she was supposed to stand in front of the largest gathering of software architects in the country and present the solution to a problem that 3 of the biggest tech firms on the continent had declared, publicly, formally, in writing, unsolvable. She counted to 31 before she reached the side door. The Canadian Software Architecture Summit had been held in Vancouver every 2 years since 2009. It was the kind of event where the lanyards were color-coded by seniority and the opening night cocktail reception cost more per head than most people's monthly grocery bills. The speakers were, without exception, men who had spent decades accumulating the kind of institutional credibility that gets you invited to speak at events like this one. The kind of credibility that has a LinkedIn profile photo taken by a professional and a Wikipedia page written by someone else. Tessa was 29 years old. She had a master's degree from the University of Waterloo, a GitHub repository that had been forked 11,000 times, and a stubborn, specific belief that the distributed systems latency problem that had stumped enterprise architecture for the better part of a decade was not, in fact, unsolvable. It had simply been approached wrong, every time, by everyone, for 12 years. She had been trying to get someone to listen to her for 18 months. The room she'd been assigned to set up in was a small anteroom off the main stage. When she pushed open the door, 2 of the 3 men already inside stopped talking. The third, a tall man with silver hair and a conference lanyard that was the color reserved for keynote speakers, looked her up and down with the particular brand of patience that isn't patience at all. "Catering's around back," he said. Tessa set her laptop bag on the nearest chair. "I'm Tessa Nwosu," she said. "I'm presenting the Meridian architecture tonight." The silver-haired man, she would find out later, his name was Dr. Leonard Ashford, former CTO of a major Vancouver firm, chair of the event's technical committee, did not apologize. He looked at the other 2 men. One of them made a small sound that might have been a cough. "The Meridian architecture," Dr. Ashford said slowly, the way someone repeats a phrase in a language they don't trust, "is a theoretical model submitted anonymously to the review committee. It hasn't been peer-reviewed. It hasn't been stress-tested at scale. And frankly, several of us have significant doubts about whether the core premise is even mathematically coherent," Tessa said. He paused. "I know," she said. "I've read the committee feedback." She opened her laptop. "That's what I'm here to address." She had been 8 years old when her mother, Dr. Adewora Nwosu, had come home from a faculty meeting at Dalhousie and sat at the kitchen table for a long time without taking off her coat. Tessa hadn't asked what happened. She'd sat across from her mother and waited, the way children who grow up in quiet, careful households learn to wait. Eventually, her mother had said, "They gave the grant to Kenneth Pfeiffer." Tessa had known even at 8 that Kenneth Pfeiffer was not the smarter researcher. "Will you apply again?" she asked. Her mother had finally taken off her coat. "Yes," she said, "that's what you do." Tessa had grown up understanding that the answer to being told no was not to argue. It was to come back with something they couldn't say no to, something so airtight, so carefully built, so rigorously proven that the only available responses were yes or silence. She had been building towards silence for 18 months. The main hall seated 400 people. Tessa had checked the registration numbers that morning, 382 confirmed attendees. engineers, architects, CTOs, academics, a handful of journalists from trade publications. The kind of crowd that knew exactly what the distributed systems latency problem was and had strong opinions about why it couldn't be fixed. Dr. Ashford had introduced her from the podium with 5 sentences and the visible bearing of a man honoring a procedural obligation. He mentioned her degree. He mentioned her submission to the review committee. He said the word unconventional twice. He did not say her name correctly. She corrected it quietly when she reached the microphone. There was a small, awkward pause. Somewhere in the third row, a woman who would later introduce herself as Dr. Petra Halvorsen from the University of British Columbia wrote something in her notebook. Tessa clicked to her first slide. 12 years ago, she said, 3 separate research teams working independently on 3 different continents each arrived at the same conclusion, that the latency ceiling in large-scale distributed systems was a fundamental architectural constraint, not a bug, not an inefficiency, a hard limit. They published their findings. The findings were peer-reviewed. The findings were accepted. And for 12 years, that conclusion has been the foundation on which an enormous amount of very expensive, very sophisticated software infrastructure has been built. She clicked to the second slide. They were all looking at the wrong variable. The room was quiet in the particular way that rooms get quiet when 400 people decide simultaneously to pay attention. She had found the error on a Thursday afternoon in February 17 months ago. She'd been sitting in the back corner of a coffee shop on King Street in Waterloo, 3 weeks out from her thesis defense, exhausted in the specific way that only comes from 6 months of staring at the same problem from every angle you can think of. She hadn't been looking for anything. She'd been procrastinating. She'd been reading a 2011 paper by a Finnish researcher named Vilho Mäkinen, who had been working on an entirely unrelated problem in telecommunications routing and had published a footnote, not even a section, a footnote, about an anomaly in packet sequencing behavior that didn't fit his model and that he'd set aside as an outlier. Tessa had read the footnote 4 times. Then she'd gone to the counter and ordered another coffee because she didn't trust what she thought she was seeing. Then she'd gone home and spent the next 11 hours building a model. At 4 in the morning, she'd called her best friend Lynn, who answered on the 3rd ring sounding exactly as annoyed as someone should sound when called at 4 in the morning. "Lynn," Tessa said, "I think I found it." "Found what?" Lynn said. "The mistake," Tessa said. "The one everyone's been making for 12 years. I think the latency ceiling isn't a ceiling. I think it's an artifact. I think Chandler and Reeves and the whole 2012 consensus got it wrong because they were measuring at the wrong point in the sequence, and I think I can prove it." There was a long pause. "Tessa," Lynn said, "I know. Chandler won a Governor General's Award. I know. His framework is in literally every major enterprise system in Canada. I know that too." Another pause. "Okay," Lynn said, "show me." The first firm she'd sent her preliminary findings to had replied in 4 days with a form letter about unsolicited submissions. The second had replied with a slightly more personal email from a junior associate who said the concept was interesting but not aligned with current research direction. The third had not replied at all. The fourth had scheduled a call which was taken by 2 engineers who spent 40 minutes explaining to her, with great patience, why the 2012 consensus was correct. When she pushed back with her modeling data, one of them had said, and she had written it down, verbatim, because she'd known she would need to remember it clearly and without distortion, "With respect, the kind of error you're describing would have been caught by some of the sharpest minds in the field. The probability that a graduate student has identified something they missed is quite low." She had thanked them for their time. She had spent the next 4 months building a prototype. The prototype worked. She'd spent another 2 months running every stress test she could construct, at every scale she could simulate, asking it to fail in every way she could imagine. It didn't fail. It performed consistently, at latency levels that should not have been possible under the accepted model. She'd submitted anonymously to the Summit Review Committee because she'd been rejected 4 times under her own name, and she needed at least one room of experts to evaluate the work before they evaluated her. The committee had accepted it. Then they'd found out who she was. Dr. Ashford had sent a personal email, which she had also saved. It had contained the phrase, "significant concerns about the presenter's practical industry experience." She had come anyway. The meridian architecture, Tessa told the room, is not a theory. It's a working system. Tonight, I'm going to show you the data. She had 40 minutes of presentation material. She'd practiced it so many times that she sometimes heard her own voice in her sleep, walking through the sequence diagrams, the benchmark comparisons, the edge case responses. She knew where the gaps were. She knew which assumptions would draw the most scrutiny. She had prepared responses to 32 distinct objections. She got through the first 15 minutes without interruption, which she hadn't expected. The room was still. People were taking notes. In the 4th row, she could see a man in a gray blazer. She recognized him from his conference photo as Marcus Trevian, chief architect at one of the largest financial systems companies in the country, who had stopped writing and was simply watching her slides. Then Dr. Ashford stood up. He was in the front row. He stood up the way men stand up when they've decided they're doing the speaker a favor. "I have to stop you there," he said, and he didn't direct this at Tessa. He directed it at the room, which told her everything. What you're describing requires the 2012 consensus to be categorically wrong, not partially wrong, not imprecise, wrong. That's a significant claim. And I think we owe it to the audience to be very clear about the level of evidence that claim requires. There was a murmur, some of it supportive of him, some of it the other kind. Tessa didn't move from the podium. "You're right," she said. "It does require that." She clicked to the next slide. "That's what the next 25 minutes are for." Someone in the middle of the room made a sound that, in another setting, would have been a laugh. Dr. Ashford sat down. He did not look pleased. She had inherited her father's patience and her mother's precision, and something from her grandmother that didn't have a clean name, a specific quality of stillness in the face of things designed to rattle you. Her grandmother, who had come to Winnipeg from Enugu in 1974 with a nursing degree and $40 and had raised 3 children in a city that had been, in those years, not always kind to her, had once told Tessa that the most powerful thing you can do when someone is trying to make you feel small is to simply continue. Not to argue, not to prove them wrong loudly, just to keep doing the thing you came to do with your full attention on the work and let the work answer for itself. Tessa had been continuing for 18 months. She continued now. The latency data appeared on the slide at the 22-minute mark, and that was the moment the room changed. She could feel it before she could describe it. A shift in the texture of the silence. The way 400 people all adjust in their seats at the same moment without realizing they're doing it. The numbers were clean. They were verifiable. They were, by any honest reading of the accepted benchmarks, impossible. And yet there they were. Marcus Trevelyan in the 4th row leaned forward. Dr. Petra Halverson stopped writing and looked up. In the back of the room, one of the journalists had her phone out and was filming. Dr. Ashford, in the front row, was very still. "These results," Tessa said, "are from live tests conducted across 3 independent cloud environments over a period of 14 weeks. The methodology is in your printed materials. The raw data is available for download tonight via the Summit portal. I have also arranged for an independent reproduction of the core test sequence to be run simultaneously right now on infrastructure hosted by 2 Canadian universities." She paused. "You can check." She had prepared for this room to argue with her. She had prepared for skepticism, for objections, for the particular kind of dismissal that comes dressed as rigor. She had not entirely prepared for what actually happened, which was that for a long moment, no one said anything at all. Then Marcus Trevelyan raised his hand. "What's the failure mode?" he said. "At maximum concurrency." What breaks first? It was the question of someone who was taking her seriously. Tessa had the answer ready. She clicked to the slide. The questions ran 40 minutes over schedule. The conference organizers kept looking at their clipboards, and then at the room, and then at their clipboards again. Nobody left. In the third row, a woman Tessa didn't recognize had started passing her business card forward to the front. 4 people had taken it, which meant she was a recruiter or an investor. And in either case, Tessa filed that away for later. Dr. Ashford asked 2 more questions. They were good questions, and she answered them. The second time, he nodded slowly, in the way of someone recalibrating. He didn't apologize for standing up in the middle of her presentation. He didn't apologize for the email, but he asked a third question, near the end, about the system's performance under adversarial network conditions, and it was a genuinely thoughtful question, and Tessa answered it and meant it when she said, "That's a good edge case. I'd like to test that further." He said, "So would I." It wasn't everything. It wasn't the full accounting she might have wanted, in some quieter part of herself. For 4 rejections and 1 condescending phone call and a security guard at the main door who had looked at her face and sent her around back. But it was something. It was the beginning of something. And Tessa had learned from her grandmother and her mother, and from 18 months of building something in the dark without permission, that beginnings were usually enough. Dr. Petra Halverson found her afterward, in the anteroom where it had all started. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and the direct manner of someone who'd spent decades in rooms where directness was the most efficient option. "I want to talk to you about replication," she said, "and about a proper peer review submission, and about whether you'd be interested in an adjunct position at UBC while you do it." Tessa said she'd be interested in the first 2 and would think about the third. Dr. Halverson nodded. "The work is real," she said. "I want you to know I can see that it's real." Tessa thanked her. She meant it, genuinely and without qualification. There is a specific kind of relief that comes not from vindication. Vindication is loud and has a shape, but from being seen clearly by someone whose seeing matters. It doesn't undo the prior dismissals. It doesn't retroactively warm the November night she'd spent walking around the outside of the building to find a side door. But it settles something. It adds a weight to one side of a scale that has been unbalanced for a long time. The write-up went live the next morning, not in a trade publication, not in an industry newsletter, on the front page of the technology section of the Globe and Mail, under the headline, "Vancouver Summit. Unknown researcher may have cracked a decade-old systems puzzle." By noon, it had been shared 14,000 times. By 3 in the afternoon, Tessa's inbox had 340 unread messages. By the time she got on the plane back to Toronto, Marcus Trevelyan's company had sent a formal request for a consultation call. She sat in the window seat and looked out at the mountains going small beneath the clouds, and thought about her grandmother, who had arrived in Winnipeg in 1974 with $40 and a nursing degree, and had continued, who had sat at a kitchen table in a coat she hadn't taken off yet and said, "That's what you do." The security guard was still at his post when she left the building. She passed close enough for him to see her face again, to see the badge now hanging correctly around her neck, the one that said "Keynote Speaker" in large letters above her name. He looked at the badge. He looked at her face. He did not say anything. She kept walking. She didn't need him to say anything. The work had already spoken. "I keep thinking about the security guard at the main door. He didn't know who Tessa was. He looked at her face, made a decision in about 2 seconds, and sent her around back. And the thing is, that moment didn't break her. It didn't even slow her down. She counted her steps to 31, found the side door, and walked in anyway. That's the part that stays with me." There's a version of this story where Tessa argues with the guard, where she pulls out her badge and demands to be let through the front, where she spends the first 10 minutes of her evening angry instead of focused. A lot of people would have done that, and honestly, I understand why. But Tessa had spent 18 months learning that the argument isn't the point, the work is the point. You win by doing the thing so well that the argument becomes irrelevant. That's what I mean when I think about integrity. Not the word on a motivational poster, but the real version of it. The version where you do the careful, honest, unglamorous work, even when nobody's watching and nobody's believing you yet. Tessa ran stress tests for 2 months on a prototype that nobody asked for. She submitted anonymously because she needed the work to be evaluated before she was. She answered Dr. Towns, Ashford's questions respectfully, even the ones that were designed more to perform skepticism for the room than to actually learn something. That's what integrity looks like in practice. It's quieter than people expect. And then there's the question of how she found the answer in the first place. She wasn't looking for it. She was reading a footnote in a Finnish researcher's paper about a completely unrelated problem. A footnote that most people would have skipped, and something in her mind said, wait. That kind of thinking doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from years of paying close attention to the edges of problems, to the things that don't quite fit, to the footnotes. Intelligence isn't just processing speed. It's the habit of staying curious even when you're exhausted, even when the official consensus says there's nothing left to find. And then there's the part that I think is the hardest to talk about without making it sound easy. She kept going. 4 rejections, 1 condescending phone call, an email from Dr. Ashford about her lack of practical industry experience, sent after the committee accepted her work and then found out who she actually was. She saved every one of those messages, not out of bitterness. She was too busy building to be bitter, but because she knew she'd need to remember them clearly, without distortion, when the moments came. That kind of persistence isn't stubbornness. It's a choice, made over and over, to believe that the work matters more than the resistance. What Tessa's grandmother told her was true. That's what you do. You come back. You build the thing they said couldn't exist. You walk in through the side door, and you present the work anyway, and then you answer the questions, all of them, including the ones from the man who tried to stop you. The work speaks. It just needs you to keep showing up until the room is ready to listen.